And welcome, folks. I'm Rob Breakenridge for NationalPost.com and NP Comments. Our guest this week is Alberta's 18th Premier. He was also a cabinet minister in the Stephen Harper government, which, of course, governed from 2006 to 2015, a longtime member of Parliament leading up to that, of course. He's now a senior advisor with Bennett Jones, LLP in Calgary. The Honourable Jason Kenney joining us here today. Mr. Kenney, great to have you with us.
Good to be here, Rob.
Well, there's a lot going on, certainly a lot to talk about. I did want to get some of your thoughts and your reflections. It was interesting timing as we sort of look at the president in the past. Last week, marking the 20th anniversary of that Conservative victory in 2006, which, of course, you were a part of. That came right on the heels of the Conservative convention right here in Calgary, as the party sort of reflects on where things are at and where it's going. Just wanted to get some of your thoughts on sort of looking back and looking forward to where you think the party's at, maybe even some of the lessons to be learned from 20 years ago.
Well, you're right. It was, by the way, fun just to be in Ottawa with old colleagues and team members, staff, elected officials, and Mr. Harper. I think what we can recall from that is that Conservatives win when A, they're united, B, they present a competent mainstream alternative that's focused on the daily concerns of voters. And, you know, that sounds pretty banal and obvious perhaps to most, Rob, but don't assume that. I mean, both Stephen Harper and I came from more of an ideological background within the Canadian Conservative movement, more specifically the Reform Party. I had been president of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, helped to found that in the early 90s when I was in my early 20s. And Stephen Harper also was president of the National Citizens Coalition. So both Stephen and I were what some call movement conservatives. And we started out in politics with a focus on a kind of a response to the view that the old PCs had been too quick and too ready to make compromises and quote unquote move to the center, and insufficiently willing to make the arguments for more limited government, fiscal responsibility, et cetera. And I think both Stephen and I, over the course of time, came to realize that you can be grounded in real convictions and principles, but you also have to meet the public where they're at and bring the public along. It's kind of the theme of Paul Wells' political biography of Stephen Harper, The Longer That I Am Prime Minister, about the power of, as Stephen used to call it, the power of the fait accompli, or the effectiveness of incrementalism. So I think those are some of the things we look back on. I think he had a very successful government, but perhaps the greatest success was unlocking the key to winning a majority, particularly in the GTA. And a big part of that, Rob, was making the Conservative Party once again a winning party amongst new Canadians, a project that I spent about 15 years of my life focused on.
Right. Yeah, definitely. You know, it's interesting, too. I mean, the Conservative Party today, I think you can point to success in changing your opponents almost, where it was the Liberals who felt that they needed to respond to kind of where the Conservatives were at and some of the policy ground that they had seized. And it does represent now, as we've seen, a shifting and evolving Liberal Party, a new kind of challenge for the Conservatives.
Yeah, for sure. In a way, you could look back as a partisan conservatives can look back at the latter Trudeau years as kind of it being relatively easy to be a conservative, and hence the 20 to 30 point lead that Mr. Poilievre sustained for the better part of a couple of years because the Trudeau government had been so deeply unpopular. And I think in retrospect, we can see that was not just a sort of fin de regime a sentiment in 2024, but in fact, Trudeau won, as you recall, only 32% of the popular vote in the 2019 and 2022 elections. And 21 election, pardon me, those two elections. He lost popular vote to both Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole. And so I think the country was ready and looking for an alternative, but the Liberals have benefited from very fortunate voter efficiency, geographic efficiency. You know, you Conservatives run up these huge leads in rural Western Canada. Liberals win by small margins in GTA ridings where you can, with a 5-point regional lead, you can suddenly pick up 45 seats in the broader GTA. And a lot of lessons to learn from that. And you're quite right. The Mr. Carney has seemed to be the man for the moment in addressing the Trump challenge, and on a whole bunch of things has moved the Liberal Party back to the center. At the same time, in a remarkable feat of political acuity, he's managed to apparently bring into the Liberal coalition half of the traditional NDP electorate and half of the traditional Bloc Québécois electorate. I think those things happen primarily because of the external threat, and these are factors that the Conservative Party's really got to get its head around.
Yeah, you mentioned the U.S. president. I think we see again this week now with the threats around the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Just, this isn't an issue that's going away anytime soon. I'm curious your thoughts. I mean, we did hear last week, of course, from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who you know well, and I'm sure maybe you weren't surprised by anything he had to say. But I think it was an important contribution to the discourse, certainly in terms of the external threats that Canada's facing right now, but also the internal threats that we're facing right now around national unity and the need to speak to both of those issues.
Yeah. I think his interventions last week which were implicit, he wasn't too explicit about this, but he was clearly addressing the threats of both Trump's annexationism and aggression and also separatism in Canada. And I think his comments were apposite. He's got a very big bully pulpit as a former prime minister who's widely respected. He's used it, I think, quite wisely and sparingly on these issues. And Stephen's reminded us that he believes the Trump threats are absolutely serious and absolutely real, and they should not be dismissed or diminished. And that we need a strategy to deal with it. As he said, that should involve counter tariffs. He understands, he and I share the view that Trump sees weakness as an invitation for more aggression. And he's also been hard-headed about the fact that while we will forever be closely tied to the United States, regardless of who the president is, we do need to get serious, really serious, about diversifying export markets, and I think the Prime Minister is trying to do that. But secondly, about domestic economic reform. And I think, Stephen was, in his Wednesday night speech last week, bang on when he said, like building coastal pipelines, for example, are a matter of national urgency. Let's just get it done. So I think that's the one point where Mr. Carney is really failing at this point. Lots of good and high expectations and incremental progress, but we need a policy revolution on those fronts, not simply baby steps.
Well, it's interesting with these two big challenges we face at the moment. I mean, there's something that speaks to both, right? It's not just about let's diversify our export markets for trade reasons and responding to the U.S., just in terms of national unity and the ability to demonstrate that Canada can work and we can accomplish big things. Right now, that's really important, isn't it?
Yeah, utterly essential for the future of the country, and partly to address these internal tensions, these separatist tensions. You can kill two birds. If you're the Prime Minister of Canada, you can kill two very big birds with one stone. One, by getting a coastal pipeline built or accelerating LNG and building export infrastructure. It's not just about pipelines. It's also about ports and rail, all of it. It's about the kind of certainty that would have Nutrien building their huge new potash terminal in Canada rather than the United States, for example. And that's going to require not just like the temporizing that we have seen, but actually walking into the House of Commons and tabling a bill to repeal the Trudeau-era Impact Assessment Act, what I call the No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69, which was substantially struck down by the Supreme Court. I always get a kick out of these Liberals being holier than thou on the independence of the judiciary, respect for the Constitution and the authority of the courts, and then promptly ignoring it when it doesn't align with their ideological agenda, in this case, environmental overregulation. So, I think he could, in one fell swoop, like in 1 month in Parliament, by repealing that, repealing the tanker ban, and the other associated Trudeau-era climate policy overreach, and doing what's necessary to accelerate the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and a greenfield pipeline. I think if those things, and if the country could see within 5 years an additional, let's call it 2 million barrels a day of oil production, huge associated upstream capital investment worth probably over $100 billion, tens of thousands of high-paying jobs, billions of dollars of revenue, tens of billions of capex on pipelines, reducing the price differential for our largest export product and moving it all on the global commodities market rather than the United States. Those things would be actual game changers, and they are within the power of the Prime Minister, and they would also, I think, take any wind out of the sails of the Alberta separatists. So I just say, let's get it done.
Absolutely. I did want to also ask you about another issue. And you served as immigration minister, of course, under Stephen Harper. So this is an issue that you know well, that's near and dear to your heart, and where we've seen, I think, a real failure over the last decade, a real broken consensus, unfortunately, in Canada when it comes to immigration. Maybe this is an area where we've started to see a slow shift toward the right direction. But I'm curious your thoughts in terms of how important it is for the government to fix this, to get this issue right.
Well, it's important for the country. Demography is destiny. And if we can see the huge political blowback, divisive blowback in other parts of the developed democratic world, in Europe and the United States, where xenophobic, anti-immigrant parties, some on the far right, are now leading in the polls. The AFD in Germany, the Front National's successor party in France, Reform in the UK, obviously MAGA in the United States, and now even in Australia, whose immigration system and political culture is the most similar to Canada. You see that suddenly from out of nowhere, their version of the People's Party of Canada, called One Nation, has gone from the fringes at like 2% with one or two senators to suddenly being in the mid-high 20s with its second place in the polls. This is a cautionary tale for naive, progressive, or liberal politicians who imagine that you can just sort of have infinity immigration with no correlation to the capacity to integrate, with no serious regard for, but rather arrogant elite dismissal of popular concerns about the downstream effects of very high levels of low-skilled migration and a failure of integration. The warning signs are blinking all across the politics of the democratic world, and Trudeau was driving us right into that scenario. He took what was the most robust, generally pro-immigration political consensus in the developed world and turned it upside down. And so I think it's urgent that the Carney government get this right. I think the significant constraints placed on the admission of new temporary residents, foreign students, and temporary foreign workers are a good and essential start. But, Rob, under the hood, and I'm not going to geek out too much on immigration policy nuances, but under the hood, I can tell you they just buggered up the whole system, okay? I'll give you just two examples quickly. Asylum claims. I went through a very tough process of reforming the refugee determination, the asylum process. And we took new claims from 45,000 a year down to under 10,000 a year. We took the inventory of pending claims from about 80,000 down to a working inventory. And we went from taking like 3 or 4 years to get to a final decision on an asylum claim to 3 to 4 months, where we were able to give people protection if they needed it or remove them if they didn't. And that was a model system. Now, under Trudeau last year, 185,000 new claims, 300,000 plus in the backlog, years and years to get to them, even though they are rubber stamping applications from entire source countries. It's just a mess. The other thing, the skilled worker program, or also known as express entry, which is the core selection of economic immigrants. It's what made our system a model globally, selecting people based on the point system, human capital. When we launched that, we were selecting people with points of at least 1,200 out of 1,300. Trudeau took that down to 75. So you have a much better chance. I mean, I'll just be blunt with you. If you're like a French-speaking immigrant with no formal education, no English language skills, but you're working at a fast-serve restaurant in Western Canada, you have a infinitely better chance of getting the gold standard permanent residency than, let's say, the quadrilingual young pediatric oncologist from Brazil I was trying to get through the system as a friend recently. So in other words, we've gone from high human capital to low human capital. That's why per capita GDP has been on a dive in part. And that's one of the reasons we're having these integration challenges.
Yeah, it's one of those issues. I mean, it's not a Western alienation issue per se, but certainly it's a big source of frustration here in Alberta, as it is in much of the country. But again, I think it's one of those sore spots or concerns about whether we're being let down by the federal government, by federal policy. I did just want to get back to the national unity question. You've been pretty outspoken in pushing back against the separatists and some of the separatist claims. We're in the midst now of this petition campaign, so we'll see what that all leads to on the referendum side. There was also, of course, more news recently about these separatist delegations to Washington, D.C., and some of these concerns about the potential, anyway, of foreign interference. I'm just curious as to where you see all of this at right now, where this is all going, and what your level of concern is.
Well, my level of concern is very high, not, Rob, because I think that they can win a majority vote in Alberta, but because I think there is a very good chance they hit the thresholds to get a referendum, and they tear this province apart for the next several months. Yeah. And you've heard me say this before. I think maybe it was on an interview I did with you, it was with the CP, where I said that this is going to result, if this happens, a months-long debate over whether we will be Canadians or not is going to rupture marriages and communities and businesses and everything. People laughed at me, but did you see this most recent Ipsos or Angus Reid poll showing 3/4 of the 70% of Albertans who would vote no now to separation say they would leave the province? Now, I see the separatists, the usual suspects, are laughing at that. I don't think it's a laughing matter, Rob. And maybe they probably all wouldn't leave because a lot of them wouldn't have the choice to. But let's say 10% of them leave, okay? Mm-hmm. Let's say 300,000, 400,000 Albertans start trying to book U-Haul and move to Ontario, BC, Saskatchewan, move back home where many of them came from, right? Rob, let's not forget, a couple million people in this province move from other parts of the country.
That's right. And
so their primary loyalty is overwhelmingly to Canada. And the same is true for international immigrants to the province and many, many native-born Albertans. So let's just say it's 250,000, 300,000-400,000 people who suddenly feel like they're no longer at home and they're no longer in their country. They leave over the course of 2-3 years. Guess what happens? Real estate values plummet, and most people's life savings are tied up in the value of their home. This is something I've been saying for months now. Because, by the way, it's not theoretical, it's not alarmism, it's history, it's a fact. It happened in Quebec between roughly 1976 and 1982. They lost 1/4 of the value of their real estate market. And it took them decades to recover. François Legault went from being a PQ separatist minister to creating a federalist party focused on economic growth rather than separation. Why? Because he said that for 40 years, Quebec had experienced substandard growth, become a have-not province because of the investor uncertainty and the distraction of separation. And I remind you, Rob, that when he said that, they never actually separated. Right. They just had this never-ending debate, these referenda. And that's what these guys want to drag us into. Just this morning I was communicating with a extraordinarily high-skilled Albertan who was born in another province, moved from another province, doing important work, who said, I'm one of those 75%. I'm already looking at leaving. So, Rob, that's my point. The very debate itself will have a cost. It will be divisive. There will be a rupture. And while I believe the hardcore separatist number is under 10%, I say that as somebody who's been very active in the trenches of the right of Alberta politics for my entire adult life, since the early 1990s. I believe it's under 10%. They can obviously get that up to 20, 30% or more by persuading frustrated federalists that it's the best way to send a message. If this thing gets a big number, let's say no magic, but north of 25%, they'll be back again and again. It will never go away. It will be like Quebec. And I don't think we want to live in a province that's constantly on edge. Constantly. I already have, when I go to business investment conferences, I already have to explain what's going on here. I wouldn't want to be the president of a publicly traded company from Alberta, having to do that for the rest of my professional life.
Well, some important weeks and months ahead, obviously, on a number of fronts here. We'll leave it there for now. Jason Kenney, appreciate your insight and perspective on all of this. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Rob.
And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Much more at nationalpost.com.